The radio crackled with static over Kandahar airfield at 3:47 hours, local time. What came next would rewrite everything the United States military thought it knew about the limits of human capability under extreme conditions. The transmission was garbled, desperate, and impossible to believe. Control, this is Phantom 6. We have confirmation of supersonic flight in zero visibility conditions. Repeat, we have visual confirmation of Mach breach in Category 5 sandstorm conditions. The controller's coffee went cold in his trembling hand. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Reaper Davidson had been managing air traffic control for 8 years across 3 combat zones. He'd seen F-22 Raptors dance through thunderstorms and watched warthogs thread canyon runs that defied physics. But what he was hearing violated every principle of aerodynamics and human survival he'd ever learned. The storm raging across eastern Afghanistan wasn't just severe, it was apocalyptic. Winds exceeded 200 miles per hour, visibility dropped to absolute zero, and sand particles moved like microscopic bullets through the atmosphere. The storm had already grounded every aircraft from Bagram to Shindand, every aircraft except one. The pilot's call sign was Mirage, and for 3 years, she'd been the subject of whispered conversations in ready rooms across the Middle East. Captain Zara Novik had earned her wings flying crop dusters over Nebraska wheat fields before enlisting at 28, older than most fighter pilots, but possessing an intuitive understanding of atmospheric conditions that instructors couldn't teach. Her personnel file read like fiction. First woman to qualify on the experimental F-35D variant, holder of 17 flight records, and survivor of a mid-air collision that should have been fatal. But tonight, respect wasn't the issue. Survival was. Somewhere in that howling darkness, 4 Navy SEALs lay bleeding in a compound 18 minutes from bleeding out. Their extraction helicopter had been shot down, their backup had mechanical failure, and enemy reinforcements were closing fast. The mission was designated impossible. Every pilot on base had reviewed the weather data and tactical assessment. The consensus was unanimous: suicide. Every pilot except Mirage. She'd simply nodded when briefed, checked her altimeter, and walked toward the hangar where her F-35D Lightning II waited like a sleeping predator. The ground crew tried to talk her out of it. The meteorologist showed her satellite images that looked like the surface of Mars. Her squadron commander actually ordered her to stand down. Her response was quiet, measured, and unforgettable. "Sir, they're not dead yet. That means there's still time." The hangar doors opened to reveal hell itself, painted in brown and black. The Lightning II she climbed into wasn't standard configuration. Mirage had spent months working with engineers to modify engine intake systems, upgrading sensor packages, and installing experimental navigation equipment that could theoretically function in zero visibility conditions. Theoretically. No one had ever tested the systems in combat, and certainly not in conditions that resembled flying through liquid concrete. As she strapped herself into the ejection seat, her crew chief, a grizzled master sergeant named Rodriguez who'd seen everything, leaned close to her helmet. "Captain, I've been turning wrenches for 22 years. This isn't flying. This is controlled falling with style." Mirage's response was lost in engine startup sequence. The twin Pratt & Whitney F-135 engines spooled up with a sound like controlled thunder. Even inside the protective hangar, sand particles rattled against metal like angry insects. The tower frequency came alive with worried voices as meteorology updated conditions. Wind shear exceeding operational limits, visibility 00, and lightning activity that would make Zeus nervous. Standard protocol demanded mission abort. But 4 SEALs were counting heartbeats instead of minutes, and Mirage had never met a storm she couldn't outfly. Her pre-flight checklist was completed with mechanical precision, while chaos ruled outside. Tower, Lightning 17 requesting immediate departure clearance. Her voice carried none of the tension that gripped everyone listening. Air traffic control responded with barely controlled panic. Lightning 17, negative on departure. Weather conditions exceed all safety parameters. You are ordered to remain on deck. The pause that followed stretched like a held breath. When Mirage finally replied, her words would be quoted in flight schools for decades. Tower, understood. Switching to emergency authorization. 4 friendlies need a ride home. The radio clicked off, leaving silence heavier than the storm itself. Rodriguez watched from the hangar doorway as Lightning 17 rolled toward the active runway. The aircraft moved with predatory grace, its angular surfaces cutting through swirling sand like a knife through smoke. The Lightning II was built for stealth and speed, but tonight it would need something more. It would need to become one with the storm itself. Mirage had studied weather patterns the way other pilots studied enemy tactics, understanding that every storm had rhythm, flow, and hidden corridors of opportunity. Tonight, she would need every lesson learned flying through Nebraska tornadoes and high plains microbursts. The runway stretched ahead like a path into the underworld. Visibility dropped to less than 10 meters as Lightning 17 positioned for takeoff. In the cockpit, Mirage's hands moved across controls with surgeon-like precision. Her modified heads-up display painted the invisible world in infrared signatures and radar shadows. The SEAL team's GPS beacon pulsed like a dying heartbeat 57 miles northeast. Between here and there lay a wall of atmospheric violence that had never been breached by human technology. Her engine temperatures climbed toward redline as she held the aircraft steady against crosswinds that could flip a tank. Lightning 17, you are cleared for emergency departure. Godspeed, Mirage. The tower's blessing came through gritted teeth. Rodriguez later said he'd never seen anything like what happened next. The Lightning II didn't just take off, it seemed to disappear into the storm like it belonged there. One moment the aircraft was visible against runway lights, the next it had become part of the darkness itself. The sound of its engines faded into the storm's roar, leaving only the question that would haunt everyone present. Had they just witnessed the most heroic flight in military history, or the most spectacular suicide? The first challenge came at Angels 2, 2,000 feet above ground level. The Lightning II hit wind shear that would have torn apart a commercial airliner. Mirage felt the aircraft drop 300 feet in seconds, then surge upward with enough force to test the limits of human consciousness. Her modified navigation system struggled to maintain position reference as the storm played havoc with GPS signals. But she'd anticipated this. Growing up in tornado country teaches you that storms aren't chaos. They're complex systems with patterns, rhythms, and exploitable weaknesses. Her father had been a storm chaser before farming, and she'd learned to read atmospheric conditions like a language. The Lightning II clawed for altitude through air thick as syrup. At Angels 5, the aircraft encountered the storm's first defensive layer, embedded thunderstorms that turned the sky into a battlefield of competing pressure systems. Lightning strikes illuminated the cockpit in strobing blue-white flashes, each one a reminder that she was flying through the electrical equivalent of a war zone. Standard procedure called for immediate course deviation. Instead, Mirage increased throttle and aimed directly for the storm's heart. Her reasoning was sound. The most violent part of the storm would also be the most direct route to the SEAL team. Every second saved meant better chances for survival. Control, Lightning 17 passing Angels 8. Storm conditions severe but manageable, maintaining course for Objective Bravo. Her transmission cut through static like a blade through silk. Ground control's response was immediate. Lightning 17, we show multiple lightning strikes in your vicinity. Recommend immediate course deviation to avoid electrical activity. Mirage's laugh was audible over the radio. Control, I'm not avoiding the lightning. I'm using it for navigation. The storm's electrical activity follows atmospheric pressure gradients. Follow the lightning, find the thermal columns. Follow the thermal columns, find the path of least resistance. It was vintage Mirage, turning conventional wisdom inside out and making the impossible sound logical. Her personnel file contained similar examples. the time she'd landed a damaged F-16 by following migrating birds to find favorable wind conditions, or when she'd used a thunderstorm's updrafts to extend fuel range during a search and rescue mission. Other pilots called it intuition. She called it applied meteorology. Tonight, that distinction could mean the difference between rescue and recovery. The Lightning II continued climbing through conditions that defied every safety protocol ever written. At Angels 12, something extraordinary happened. The aircraft broke through the storm's lower chaos into a zone of relative stability, the eye wall equivalent of a massive atmospheric disturbance. Here, Mirage could finally assess her situation and plan the next phase of what was becoming the most technically challenging flight in modern military history. The Lightning II's modified sensors painted a three-dimensional picture of the storm's internal structure, revealing corridors of opportunity invisible to conventional navigation. But the SEAL team's beacon was still 38 miles away, and the storm's most violent region lay directly ahead. The radio crackled with an unexpected transmission. Any aircraft, this is Ground Team Alpha. We have 4 wounded requiring immediate extraction. Time critical. Repeat, time critical. The SEAL team's communications specialist was breaking radio discipline, which meant their situation had deteriorated beyond desperate. Mirage's response came without hesitation. Ground Team Alpha, Lightning 17 inbound your position. Estimated time of arrival 12 minutes. Prepare for unconventional extraction procedures. What she didn't mention was that reaching their position would require flying through atmospheric conditions equivalent to the inside of a Category 5 hurricane, at supersonic speeds, in zero visibility. The Lightning II's engines were pushed beyond normal operational parameters as Mirage committed to a flight profile that existed only in theoretical textbooks. She would need to achieve supersonic flight while navigating through atmospheric conditions that would challenge the structural integrity of any aircraft ever built. The modified F-35D could theoretically handle the stress, but theory and reality were about to collide at Mach 1.2 in the middle of the worst storm Afghanistan had seen in decades. Her hands steady on the controls, Mirage began the acceleration sequence that would either save 4 lives or end 5. The transition to supersonic flight in a dust storm defied everything the aviation community thought possible. As the Lightning II approached Mach 1, the aircraft encountered a phenomenon no pilot had ever experienced. Sonic interference patterns created by the interaction between shock waves and suspended sand particles. The result was a flight environment that challenged both human perception and mechanical systems in ways never anticipated by designers. Mirage felt the aircraft shudder as it pushed through the sound barrier, but instead of the familiar sonic boom, the storm absorbed and scattered the shock wave into a sustained rumble that seemed to shake the Earth itself. Control, Lightning 17 has achieved supersonic flight in storm conditions, all systems nominal, beginning tactical descent toward Objective Bravo. Her voice remained calm, professional, almost conversational. But in the background, those listening could hear the muted roar of engines operating at maximum continuous power, and the subtle vibration that indicated an aircraft performing at the absolute edge of its design envelope. The flight data recorder would later show that Lightning 17 sustained speeds exceeding Mach 1.3 for over 6 minutes, while navigating through atmospheric conditions, equivalent to flying inside a concrete mixer. Ground Team Alpha's position was in a valley surrounded by ridgelines that funneled wind speeds to over 180 miles per hour. The extraction point was a rocky clearing barely large enough for a helicopter landing zone, now made invisible by swirling sand and debris. Standard extraction procedures would have required a combat search and rescue helicopter with specialized equipment and a full support package. Mirage was planning to extract 4 wounded SEALs using an F-35D Lightning II in conditions that would challenge the most experienced helicopter pilot. The technical impossibility of the situation was matched only by the absolute necessity of attempting it. The Lightning II's descent through the storm's lower levels was a masterpiece of precision flying under impossible conditions. Mirage used a combination of radar altimetry, GPS navigation, and pure atmospheric intuition to guide the aircraft toward a landing zone she couldn't see. Her modified heads-up display showed terrain elevation and wind vectors, but the actual visual references remained hidden behind walls of wind-driven sand. At 500 feet above ground level, she made the decision that would define her career. Instead of attempting a conventional landing, she would use the Lightning II's vertical landing capability to hover-extract the SEAL team directly from their defensive position. The transition from forward flight to vertical hover in storm conditions had never been attempted in combat operations. The Lightning II's vectored thrust system was designed for controlled environments, not for maintaining position in winds that exceeded the aircraft's maximum crosswind limitations. But Mirage had been studying the interaction between jet exhaust and atmospheric disturbances, developing techniques that existed nowhere in official flight manuals. As the aircraft slowed to hover speed, she used differential thrust vectoring to create a localized area of relative calm, essentially using the Lightning II's engines to carve a temporary safe zone out of the storm itself. Ground Team Alpha, Lightning 17 in position overhead. Mark your location with infrared strobes. I'm coming down. The SEAL team's response was immediate. 4 infrared beacons created a landing pattern visible only to Mirage's modified sensor package. What followed was a landing sequence that redefined the boundaries of what was considered possible in military aviation. The Lightning II descended vertically through hurricane-force winds, its pilot using engine management techniques that had never been tested, toward a landing zone that existed more in faith than reality. The margin for error was measured in inches and seconds. Rodriguez later described watching the sensor feeds as like watching someone thread a needle during an earthquake. The Lightning II's hover descent was a ballet of controlled violence, with Mirage adjusting thrust vectors dozens of times per second to compensate for wind shear that would have been fatal to conventional aircraft. At 50 feet above ground level, the aircraft's downwash began interacting with the terrain, creating a complex pattern of air currents that required constant correction. The SEAL team, watching from their defensive position, later reported that the aircraft seemed to materialize out of the storm like an apparition. One moment they were alone in hell, the next a guardian angel was descending from chaos itself. The actual extraction took 4 minutes and 37 seconds. 4 wounded SEALs, each weighing over 200 pounds with equipment, were loaded into an aircraft designed for single-pilot operations. Mirage had removed every non-essential component from the Lightning II's cockpit area to create space for passengers, but the aircraft was still operating far beyond its intended capacity. The additional weight would affect every aspect of the return flight: acceleration, climb rate, fuel consumption, and structural stress. But as the last SEAL was secured in the improvised passenger compartment, Mirage's only comment was, "Gentlemen, I hope you enjoy unconventional transportation methods." The vertical takeoff from Ground Team Alpha's position was even more challenging than the landing. The overloaded Lightning II struggled to generate sufficient thrust for vertical lift in the storm conditions. Mirage was forced to use a technique she developed during experimental test flights, using the storm's own updrafts to assist the aircraft's climb rate. By positioning the Lightning II in specific relationship to terrain features, she could harness the chaotic air currents and turn them from obstacle to advantage. The aircraft rose from the landing zone like a phoenix emerging from a furnace, carrying its precious cargo towards safety through conditions that continued to defy description. The return flight to Kandahar airfield would become the stuff of legend. The overloaded Lightning II, carrying 4 passengers it was never designed to accommodate, navigated back through the storm, using a flight path that seemed to anticipate atmospheric conditions before they developed. Mirage's understanding of weather patterns allowed her to find corridors of relative stability within the chaos, threading the aircraft through spaces between wind shear zones with precision that seemed almost supernatural. The SEAL team, cramped into a space barely large enough for one person, later reported that the flight felt like riding inside a controlled avalanche with someone who could see the future. At Angels 15, climbing out of the storm's grip, Lightning 17 encountered clear air for the first time in over an hour. The contrast was startling, from zero visibility to crystalline clarity in seconds. Behind them, the storm continued its rampage across eastern Afghanistan, a wall of darkness that seemed to swallow the earth itself. Ahead lay the lights of Kandahar airfield, where every person on duty waited for confirmation that the impossible had been achieved. Mirage's transmission was characteristically understated. Control, Lightning 17 returning to base with 4 passengers. Request priority landing clearance and medical support on the ground. The landing at Kandahar was witnessed by half the base. Word had spread through military communication networks about the impossible extraction mission, and personnel from every unit gathered along the flight line to watch Lightning 17 return from what many had assumed would be a suicide mission. The aircraft touched down with mechanical precision, its landing gear absorbing the impact of an overloaded airframe with barely a shudder. As the engine spooled down and the canopy opened, a cheer went up from the assembled crowd, not the usual restrained military applause, but a spontaneous explosion of admiration for an achievement that redefined what they thought possible. The 4 SEALs were transferred to medical personnel within minutes of landing. Each would survive their wounds and return to operational status within weeks, but their rescue was only part of the story that would spread through military circles worldwide. The primary narrative was about a pilot who had taken an impossible mission and turned it into a textbook example of innovation under pressure. As Mirage climbed down from the Lightning II's cockpit, her flight suit soaked with sweat and her helmet marked with the scars of sand impact, she was met by her squadron commander and a gathering crowd that included some of the most experienced pilots in the military. The debriefing session lasted 6 hours and involved personnel from multiple commands. Flight data from Lightning 17 revealed performance parameters that challenged existing understanding of aircraft capabilities and human endurance. The modified F-35D had sustained operational stresses beyond its design specifications, while maintaining flight safety standards that impressed even the most critical observers. But the real revelation was in the flight path analysis. Mirage had not simply survived the storm, she had used it as a navigational tool, finding energy patterns and atmospheric corridors that allowed supersonic flight through conditions previously considered impossible for any aircraft. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who had watched the entire mission unfold from ground control, was asked to summarize the achievement for the official record. His response became part of military folklore. "Sir, I've been working on aircraft for over 2 decades. I've seen pilots do impossible things in impossible conditions. But tonight, I watched someone rewrite the rules of what aircraft can do and what pilots can survive. Captain Novik didn't just complete a rescue mission. She proved that the only real limitations in aviation are the ones we accept." The room fell silent as the implications of that statement settled over everyone present. The story of Lightning 17's storm mission spread beyond military channels within days. Aviation publications requested interviews, aerospace engineers wanted to study the flight data, and meteorologists sought to understand how atmospheric conditions had been used as navigational aids. But Mirage herself remained characteristically focused on operational concerns rather than public recognition. Her only comment to the media was simple: the aircraft performed as designed, the team executed their mission, and 4 good men went home to their families. That's what we're here for. The understatement was vintage mirage, but it couldn't diminish the significance of what had been accomplished. 3 weeks later, at a ceremony attended by senior officers from multiple branches of the military, Captain Zara, Mirage, Novik was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor device. The citation read in part, "For extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight under extremely hazardous conditions." Captain Novik's exceptional skill, courage, and determination in the face of overwhelming odds resulted in the successful extraction of 4 wounded personnel from a hostile environment during severe weather conditions that had grounded all other aircraft. Her actions reflect the highest credit upon herself and the United States Air Force. But for those who witnessed the mission, the real award was knowing that impossible had become possible in the hands of someone who refused to accept limitations. The technical analysis of the Lightning 17 mission resulted in modifications to flight training programs across all service branches. The techniques Mirage had developed for storm navigation, atmospheric energy utilization, and extreme condition aircraft handling became part of advanced pilot curriculum. Her innovations in vertical landing procedures under adverse conditions influenced development of next-generation aircraft systems. The mission data was classified, but the principles derived from her flight became foundational elements of modern combat aviation doctrine. In the words of the Test Pilot Evaluation Board, Captain Novik's mission represents a paradigm shift in understanding the relationship between pilot capability, aircraft performance, and environmental conditions. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the culture of military aviation itself. The Lightning 17 mission had demonstrated that exceptional pilots could achieve results far beyond conventional expectations when supported by innovative technology and uncompromising commitment to mission success. Flight schools began emphasizing intuitive flying skills alongside technical proficiency. Engineering programs incorporated studies of atmospheric dynamics and weather pattern recognition. The mission had proved that the most advanced technology was only as capable as the human operating it, and that human capability extended far beyond previously accepted limits when necessity demanded excellence. Years later, the 4 SEALs from Ground Team Alpha would remain in contact with Mirage, forming bonds forged in the crucible of shared survival. They would attend her promotion ceremonies, her retirement, and eventually her induction into the Aviation Hall of Fame. The inscription on her Hall of Fame plaque reads simply, "She proved that the sky has no limits for those who refuse to accept them." But those who knew the full story understood that the real tribute was in the lives saved, the barriers broken, and the expansion of human possibility that her one impossible night had achieved. The storm that had raged over eastern Afghanistan for 3 days finally dissipated on the morning after Lightning 17's mission. Local meteorologists noted that it had been one of the most severe atmospheric disturbances ever recorded in the region. International weather services classified it as an extreme event that occurred perhaps once per century. But for Captain Zara, Mirage, Novik, it had been simply another day at the office. A day when the impossible became inevitable through the application of skill, determination, and an absolute refusal to let good people die on her watch. The legend of the pilot who broke Mach in a dust storm would inspire generations of aviators, but for Mirage herself, it was simply proof that there was always a way through, over, or around any obstacle. You just had to be willing to find it.